going on? Hotep. This is Wise Logic. I'm here at the ASCAT conference, just soaking up the vibe here with the Kepler Institute, meeting a lot of amazing people. I must say it's an interesting day. I'm going to start off with this pyramid in the back. It came out of nowhere. And one of my good teachers here in Hotep, and actually the builder of the pyramid, history, but we're going to get into that later. But I just want to say having a great time. I'm about to enjoy myself lecturing, and hope to hear from you real quick.
Thank you, everyone. It's certainly good to be here at ASCAT. I just want to introduce the idea of the charts and the gentleman who will be making the presentation today, Mr. Wise Logic. And the reason I wanted to introduce the idea of the chart is because when my husband started thinking about just how to pull historical events together and Africa's influence on those historical events and world civilizations, he thought about it, and he was going to do a computer program. Well, we're talking 1988, 1989, and the programs weren't there. So as he, believe me, we did this on an 8088. I didn't say anything about a Pentium, but we started on an 8088. And as he evolved the whole program, he decided that he would make it in a chart. And with the chart, the different pieces of the chart, as Mr. Logic will talk to you about, brings together in a very plain way Africa's contributions to world civilizations. My husband he had a gift of memory. I really think photogenic memory. He could remember books, dates, publishers, when it hit the stores, things that he had read, books from ancient times, which are on here also. And as he put the chart together and I saw it evolve, I was just so pleased. So after he passed in 1992, I said to myself, as long as I have breath, the charts will be available. But in the tradition of all people Philly, but especially black people, one carries information along with them. And it's always up to us to reach back and to bring the next generation along with that same information. It's so wonderful to see young people in the room to say they want to step there. So I want to step over here and have Mr. Wise Logic, part of our Kepler Institute, our young people moving forward to present the charts. Thank you.
Hotep, everyone. Hotep. The main focus that I'm going to be emphasizing today are the references and the connection to all of this information. Starting with this circle. The green portion of this circle represents all African cultures that originated in Africa. The yellow portion represents all cultures that have existed, originated outside of Africa. An example of these cultures would be China, Japan, Southeast Asia, and Mesopotamia. Another key example about this chart is that each arch represents a period of time of its origins, of its beginning or downfall, or is still in its existence today. An example of this would be going to China. If we look at China and we look at number 1, we will go to number 1 on the chart where it says China, located right here. And if you notice, China has an arch 1, and if you notice in the box with China, China has 24 historical events that Dr. Turner outlined that were significant in Chinese history. But the main key to that, he lines it up with what was going on else in the world with other historical events, the whole connection. That's the main emphasis of the charts, of the connection. If you look at the connection, you look at number 1, number 1 says the Shang Dynasty. Now, what's significant about the Shang Dynasty is that he also put African influences chart right here. He put a number 2. But if you go to the number 2, red arrow connected to the number 1, it gives you an outline of what the Shang Dynasty, how they were described. And they were described as black with oily skin, basically describing that the first emperors and the first people to originate in China were woolly haired, thick lips, black skinned people. Also, another significance about the charts is that each number, he goes from 300 each number goes from 375 years. So there's a 375-year increment that he spans. And in between these years, it's not exact, but it's a guesstimate, an approximate number of some of these cultures. Starting at 4000 BC, he made it clockwise that if you go from 4000 BC and it goes all the way around clockwise, it ends at 2000 AD. So that's a 6,000 year. So that's a 6,000 year period that he says Africans have had major contributions all across the world. Another important history about this, another important event, significance about this chart is that he has 11 boxes with 13 African countries in it. Now, these 13 African countries are significant dealing in this part of the period because chattel slavery, which we all know, a European form of slavery, existed. But at the time of chattel slavery, most of these 13 countries had developed highly sophisticated forms of knowledge and culture and civilization that prior to slavery, into slavery, and even periods after slavery, and even periods now that these highly sophisticated forms of civilization still exist now. Also, if we go to the 5 maps, there's 5 maps. Dr. Fair has outlined. The first map details the major oceans, rivers, and waters that were essential to Kemetic culture, but not just to Kemetic culture, all African cultures. An example of these, you have Lake Victoria, the Volta, the Nile River, the Blue and the White Nile, the Gambia River, and the Congo River, all essential. So you could go from south, east, west, and north and find these rivers that were essential to each culture that developed in Africa. The next map represents European colonization, the height of European colonization just prior to World War I, 1914. Each color is represented by a European or a European nation that took over that part of Africa prior and into World War and after World War I and going into World War II. The next map, the third map, signifies African countries, and the red dot signifies their capital. This one represents traditional old African cultures that went by, that old traditions had names for. If you look, we have the Congo, we have Manapotampa, we also have Ghana, Mali, and we also have the Songhai. These are all names that Africans had went by into the ancient period, going into a period of AD. Also, in the last chart, we also have Kemetic civilization, where he has outlined going down from the lower part of Kemet down to the upper part of Kemet. He has the significant structures. He also has the Kemetic name. He also uses the Greek name. And the reason why this is important because he outlines the significant structures of their buildings. And as we all know, there were more pyramids to the south than there was in the north. So this is important because it gives you the name, the location, and why these rivers were important to these architecture and to these buildings. If we go to the statistics portion of the chart, the statistics portion of the chart represents 41 countries, gives the 41 capitals of those countries, and the statistics goes up to 1981. But the reason why these statistics are important because they give you an idea of what Africans lost before colonization, during colonization, and after colonization, and even still today. The resources that were lost, and it also explains their independence after colonialism. And some may argue that colonialism still exists in Africa today. True. So the idea that he has, there's an idea that the year of colonial independence, that's very important because we can take this year and we can refer back and see when was the year that they had, when was the year they suppose they gained their independence, but it can also refer you back to a time period of when they were colonized. This is connected, so that statistics is directly connected to that. Also, if we look at the red bordered boxes, these are just famous quotations, African sources that exclaim and that actually detail African knowledge outside of just African sources. So we may not always need to use Dr. Clark's book. We could go to Count Volume. If you don't believe Dr. Clark, we can always go to another source outside of African sources to say, hey, this culture was happening, this is what was going on, and they did have a highly advanced form of civilization prior to what Westerners say in the textbooks that we read today. Also, we have the 10 points that Sheikh ATV approved in the 1974 UNESCO conference in Cairo, Egypt, and he laid out the 10 proofs explaining how the Egyptians were black. Dr. Fair has laid out the 10 proofs. The main importance, and another key component of the chart are over 40 references. The chart is used, the chart main emphasis is the references. It allows you to refer to information, use that information, and it points you back to the source of that information, so you therefore get your own perspective about how it's all connected, why it's all connected. That was one of the main emphasis of the chart. Also, if we go all the way over here, he has a Kemetic dynasty outline. He starts at 3200 BC and he ends it at the death of Alexander the Great. He starts, though, with the first dynasty at 2800 BC, and he expands all the way down to the last of the great golden ages of the Pharaonic period, and that would be the fourth dynasty, and that would be around the 700 BC, which we will call the 25th dynasty, Taharqa, Pianki, and all of them. That was expanded 2,100 years. That is significant because if you look at all of this, if you take all of this historical timeline and you connect it to the circle timeline, what you would get if you wanted to go to 2800 BC. So from the time of 2800, so from the time of 3250 to 2800 BC, you already had the first pharaoh of Egypt building. You already had the first pharaoh uniting Egypt, and you also had civilization that had thrived in the Nile Valley prior to the very first unity of Lower and Upper Kemet. Also, if you look at 14 and 17, and if we go to the arrows, 14 and 17 gives you that around this time that the first dynasty was being united, you had some of the holy texts for papyri being written, sacred writings being written. That would be 14. But if you go to 17, you had the Ishango bones, you had highly formed sophisticated math, writing, language, technology, steel, iron. Everything that made culture, everything that made civilization was occurring and existing around this time. And as we can see, this occurred and this happened way before we get to the Greeks. At around this time, if you get to the Greeks does not come into the picture until at least about 1750 BC. And if you go to the Greek part, at this time, the Greeks were just now building palaces known as they were known as monomons. At this particular time, we also have linear A writing. So Greeks are now just starting to understand writing, but African culture starts up here. So that's the connection that the charts can make on that level. Also, dealing with going back to chattel slavery, that would be important because from the time of the 8th century AD, going all the way up into the 15th century AD, you had the Moorish occupation. That is essential because if you notice, after the Moorish occupation, you have chattel slavery. That connection is that at that time, Europe was beginning to come out of its dark age, was beginning to understand newly forms of knowledge, was beginning to get back to sea again and understand longitude and latitude at sea. And this time, they were taking this knowledge that was left over by the Moorish Empire. They basically co-opted, took it for themselves, learned it for themselves, and hence, therefore, created their idea of history and created how they were going to expand in a European Western way. Also, the main emphasis that Dr. Fair created the chart was that he was really hopeful that this chart would stimulate young people to go out, search their history, understand their history, but find a connection into their history. This chart basically helped me out, and it helped me to find my way and find how I can navigate and maneuver through a world that tells me I don't have a history.
All right.
So understanding all of this information, but also he goes back to the 5 billion year period of history, and he also gives you the origin of when man. And that's important because most scholars or most Western scholars will tell you that man was created in Western Asia, misnomered as the Middle East. They would say that that's where civilization came from. But what Dr. Fair is outlining is that the 6 earliest forms that he has right here, all 6 fossils of early man found only in Africa, modern Homo sapiens are born in Africa. So that is essential in understanding the origins of Africa, but also in understanding the origins of humanity. That all knowledge and all forms of knowledge originated here, migrated out of here, and created all of these subcultures that you see in the yellow. We also have in this particular section, if we was to go to 20 and we were to wrap in the Americas, if we go to the 18 and 20 African influences of the Americas, what we had is that the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture is going on. We also have, during this period, you have Africans provided free labor to the continent Africans provided free labor that made the continent rival European powers because of natural resources. But if we go to 20, after the slavery period, continuing to the present, African Americans were still made contributions to world culture. So that's why this chart is important. When we're told that we never made any significant contributions, but if you look on this chart, you see all of the contributions all around in green. That is essential to understanding why our history is important, how we connect it.